Right, I think it's time to begin. Welcome and thank you for joining us for this discussion of what is perhaps going to be the most important topic in economic policy in the coming months. And that is, of course, the matter of employment, jobs and the labour market. One of the most distinctive features of the UK economy in the post-2008 landscape has been the extremely strong performance of the labour market from its peak of 8.5% unemployment in late 2011, which itself pales into insignificance when compared to the double-digit peaks of the 1980s and the early 90s. Unemployment has been on a solidly downward trajectory ever since, bottoming out at 3.8% in 2019, lowest since 1974. The UK hasn't really experienced severe unemployment for quite some time, but is all of that about to change as the unprecedented measures taken in response to the COVID-19 pandemic come to an end at the end of this month? Now, back in May, to give just one example, chief economist at the Bank of England, Andy Haldane, warned that the UK is at risk of returning to the 1980s level of unemployment. Now, since then, we have had the government's plan for jobs announced in July and the winter economy plan outlined in September, both of which carry a host of new active labour market measures, some of them similar to what has been done before, others not so much in any case, giving us plenty to discuss. Now, joining us for this discussion is first of all the Right Honourable Dr. Thérèse Coffey, who is, of course, Secretary of State for Work and Pensions since 2019 and has previously served as Minister of State at the Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Prior to entering politics, she had a successful career in management accounting, including a stint as a finance director, and holds a PhD in chemistry from UCL. She has been a Member of Parliament for Suffolk Coastal since 2010. We also have Pam Meadows, who is an associate at the economics consultancy Volterra and a former chief economist at the then Department for Employment, and as such had a front row seat in the novel active labour market measures instituted in the 1980s. And lastly, we have Warwick Lightfoot, who is the former special advisor to 3 chancellors in the late 80s and early 1990s, is now head of economics here at Policy Exchange, and is, something I should probably bear in mind when asking him questions, my immediate superior. Now, we're going to start by giving each panel member around 5 minutes or so to give their opening take on this matter. Then I'm going to ask some questions and kick off the discussion, and then we're going to turn to the audience for more questions. So, without further ado, let's first go to the Work and Pension Secretary, the Right Honourable Dr. Thérèse Coffey.
Well, thank you very much, Jan, and it's a great pleasure to be here today at the Policy Exchange event. And I was reflecting that having just been in place just over a year as Secretary of State at DWP, to have enjoyed the highest employment rate ever, the highest record number of women in work ever, to then suddenly have a jolt to the system that COVID-19 brought to our country with its public health emergency, but also the economic impact that's happened as a consequence. Now, what we're still seeing in our labour markets is that actually employment rates are still at a high, and some of that is because people may not be working in the normal sense, but are not actually actively seeking new work in quite the same way they may have done in previous recessions. But I think the other kind of key distinction, 2 other key distinctions that we face right now are, one, this is the highest and fastest number of people turning towards the welfare system that's ever happened in quite the scale and quite the time, in that we've had higher people seeking welfare benefits, but not in the space of just 2 or 3 months. But also the challenge of how we see this economy unfolding as we make in particular responses to health needs on how that then impacts on the economy. And for the first time in this country, we've had the level of interventions that you referred to earlier, not only the plan for jobs announced in July, but the emergency measures announced in March, when we also had an injection of over £9 billion into the welfare system, but also the unprecedented in the UK of the job furlough scheme and the support for self-employed. So thinking ahead about the plan for jobs that we have put in place, but also some of the successor to the furlough scheme as outlined by Rishi Sunak in the winter economy statement, I think if you look back to the 70s and 80s and 90s, and indeed the noughties, about how it's unfolded in different ways. And going back to the 70s, in fact, actually there was a lot more unionised sorts of measures. The labour market wasn't particularly flexible. People were on strike more. And we saw a different kind of wave, if you like, of impacts on the economy, which of course then resulted in the Thatcher government coming into place. Again, we then saw a way of how we needed to change the economy for the benefit of the country after those years in the basically the Callaghan wilderness, and to try and turn around the UK PLC. And that led to an element of flexibility in the market. But as a consequence, there were definitely some structural unemployment changes that happened as certain types of industry that were no longer really viable at that time in the UK. Instead, the jobs that replaced them were not necessarily in the same parts of the country or indeed the same skill set. So actually there was this deeper, longer term unemployment, which until the mid-80s, or just a few years later, as we started to see the Restart programme come into place, but also bringing people like Nissan into the country to try and rejuvenate parts of the country where manufacturing had been a long-term kind of element of the economy. Those sorts of changes took more time to come through. Then we get into the 90s and the initial elements of inflation, chasing the ECU rate with very high interest rates, led subsequently to a significant shock again. And then finally into the financial crisis, where we saw that long-term effect that happened. But meanwhile, one of the benefits that had happened with the labour market adjusting was that we saw, I would suggest, perhaps not quite the same structural impact that had been the outcome of previous recessions. So where are we now? So we're in a situation where we've managed to try and keep through furlough, people attached to their employer, and that helped millions of people. And without it, frankly, I expect that we would have seen more people turn to the universal credit system for the welfare safety net. That said, we already had several million people turn towards us. Remember one particular day when we had over 100,000 people apply, and I'm very impressed at how our systems and our people stood up to the challenge to make that happen. But in the short term, we came up with a plan for jobs, and which we are now starting to roll out. So things like, in effect, a job creation scheme that will be mutually beneficial for the young person through Kickstart, but also for the employer, as there's an element of direct subsidy of wages, but also training funds that go with that, and it being, as I say, a mutual relationship, as well as the expansion of other programs that we will start to see coming through to help people perhaps consider a slightly different career, even if it's just for a few years, while their sector struggles to recover. So these are things called swaps, which we already had in existence, and will be boosting other elements of our employment programme over the next few weeks and months. So in a word, what have we learned from the past? Actually, we've had to learn to be agile, because this recession is unlike any other before, but also rebuilding from what happened in the late noughties. We've actually tried to make the way back into work as easy as possible for people, not putting loads of constraints on kind of grant schemes that happened with the Future Jobs Fund, which actually led to very little involvement in the private sector, but really try and open up the spectrum so that together we can actually try and help Britain get back on its feet as quickly as possible.
Thank you very much, Thérèse. We will now go to Pam Meadows.
Thank you. I think some of the key lessons from the 1980s are to tell us how not to do things. And the Secretary of State has referred to some of the more positive things that are happening. But one of the things that we need to think about is why the current situation is different. The first is that the new inflows into unemployment are going to be geographically dispersed across the whole country. And one of the things that happened in the 1980s was a lot of concentration, particularly in single employer towns, but actually in industry-focused regions. But the sectors which are experiencing difficulty at the moment are widespread across the whole country. And I think that's quite helpful, because instead of having to find a way to get a lot of jobs into a relatively concentrated area, we have to try and find a lot of jobs across the whole of the rest of the country. The second thing that's different is that the industries which are experiencing both long-term structural decline like retail, but also immediate disruption like hospitality, travel, wedding planning, that we know that ultimately those industries are quite viable and are going to come back. But also the people doing the jobs in those industries don't necessarily think of themselves as being, you know, their whole identity is bound up in the way that people's identity was often bound up in their work in the 80s. The sort of people who lost their jobs in the 80s, steel workers, car workers, miners, their identity was tied up with that sort of job. And actually people who work in shops and bars, organising weddings, on the whole, they're much more flexible in their approach to what is the sort of work that they might do. There are a few problem groups, you know, airline pilots. I'd have thought their identity is quite well tied up with their jobs, and there's going to be a big slump in demand for airline pilots. But we're going to be focusing on a group of people who are willing to look at quite a wide range of options. And finally, we have the issue about women versus men. A lot of the jobs which are being lost, or which are going to be lost in the current circumstances, are being done by women. And in the 1980s, a lot of the jobs that were lost were being done by men. And I think that, you know, while not stereotyping, if you look at women's careers and men's careers, women quite often have to change jobs and do something different. And they always have done. And I think looking forward, it's potentially quite useful to think about the fact that we have a pool of people who are quite flexible and who just want the right opportunities. And I suppose the other lesson I want to talk about is don't drive people out of the labour market to massage the numbers. The big mistake that was made during the 80s was to try and keep measured unemployment down. You know, I'm a fan of The Wire. You know, juking the stats is one of the themes through The Wire, both in the education system and in the police and the criminal justice system. For goodness sake, don't try to massage the numbers. Try and keep people engaged with the labour market. And you know, it is better to subsidise jobs that will be viable in the long run than to just give people something to do, because just giving them something to do is not necessarily going to be helpful for, you know, the economy and productivity of the future. My final point is about incentives. That we are going to have a bunch of people flowing into unemployment who have mortgages, car loans, financial commitments. Universal credit keeps people out of poverty, but actually doesn't maintain their incomes. And those people have very powerful incentives to get any sort of job. I think those are the key messages.
Okay, thank you very much. And finally now, let's turn to Warwick.
Well, I think that the remarkable thing is that, in fact, before I worked at the Treasury, I worked at the Department of Employment. And the story there was that whatever was going on in the British economy, its Achilles heel was the labour market. And whether it was the mass unemployment of the 1920s and the 1930s, or the balance of payments crisis we experienced in the 1950s and the 1960s, the weak link was always the behaviour of the labour market. And as Thérèse pointed out, that a lot of that turned on the framework of industrial relations law that was put in place before the First World War and made it very difficult to have proper wage-setting regimes. And I think one of the big tests of any economy is how can it deal with an adverse economic shock, and in particular, how well can its jobs market deal with that? And unless you have realistic pay bargaining that takes account of what's actually going on rather than what you hope is going on, you end up with very high levels of permanent structural unemployment when you suffer an adverse shock. And that was the story of the UK labour market in the interwar years and increasingly in the 1970s and in the 1980s. Another feature of the 1980s was that when you have a welfare state that supports people, you've got to be very careful to ensure that you don't just pay benefits to people, but you keep in touch with them. so that you ensure that they are available for work, they are actively looking for work, and you help them to find the opportunities that are in the labour market. There's always a lot of pushing and shoving in any labour market, and there will always be opportunities in the labour market, and you've got to help people find those opportunities. And it's not just, if you like, the stick of, are you getting on and looking for work, but also very much the carrot and the incentive of we're here to help you. In very difficult circumstances, like the ones we're going to have in the coming months and maybe years, sometimes those opportunities have got to be provided by the state itself through training, work opportunities, job subsidies, and other enterprise measures. And that's where active labour market measures take on their meaning, that you ensure that there's active opportunities that keep people in touch with the jobs market, and you don't allow whole thousands of people actually lose confidence and lose interest in the labour market, so that your labour force actually atrophies and you don't have people playing within the system. And that's the way you avoid much of the scarring and the so-called hysteresis that we actually had in the 1980s. And I think it's fair to say in the 1980s, we were a little bit slow to get on with that side of things. And it wasn't until very much the mid-1980s, after 1985, and the late 1980s, early 1990s, that the department really got a grip on that. One aspect of this, and I know that the Secretary of State is well seized with this because we've talked about this before, and it's greatly to the government's credit, is that you've got to resource your employment service with the people and the money to help people who need help. And as the economy recovers and unemployment begins to fall, it's very important that the Treasury doesn't withdraw that support from the department too quickly. That was one of the mistakes made in the 1980s and in the 1990s. The final thing I'm going to say is that however well your labour market functions, however efficient it is, however much it exhibits price adjustments rather than quantity adjustments, in a context where you have an overall economic shock that affects all markets, not just the labour market, you will not have pleasing results in terms of employment and low unemployment unless you ensure there's sufficient demand in the economy. And the big difference between the present circumstances and most of my previous working life has been that there really may be an absence of overall demand in the economy at the moment that can only be rectified by macroeconomic policy and stimulus coming from monetary policy and fiscal policy. And in the present circumstances where monetary policy is highly constrained, that will probably have to turn, if we need it, by using fiscal policy. And there's one further piece of good news, apart from the supply side improvements in the UK economy and the labour market over the last 35 years, and that is that policymakers today, unlike when I worked at the Department of Employment, will not have the constraints of high and erratic inflation that the Secretary of State just mentioned in 1990, and also very high nominal and real interest rates. That means that borrowing and net public expenditure at the margin is really very expensive in terms of debt service charges. And I think that that is going to be very helpful for policymakers, because it will give them the scope to have the macro response needed to support an efficient labour market.
Thank you very much. Let's turn to one of the things that was raised in the Secretary of State's speech, and that is the issue of resilience of the welfare employment administration systems to the increased demand. Now, we know that in the immediate run-up to the pandemic, the department shifted civil servants to the front line in anticipation of increased demand, and it also accelerated the digitalization of some of the provision of some of the services that it offers to cope with the social distancing measures. Now, I was wondering if you could just slightly elaborate on how, what else is the department doing to as Warwick touched on, prepare for that increased demand on the system, and to I suppose learn that lesson of the 80s, that you have to keep it at the forefront of your spending decisions.
Thanks, Jan. Well, the department is actively recruiting another 13,500 work coaches and as well as other staff that will accompany that, so people we consider to be our decision makers. And that's to make sure that when the vacancies start to go up, we can try and help people, as I say, pivot potentially into new lines of career or back into work, as Pam referred to try and make sure that people can take on roles more quickly that will be more generous to them in their monthly kind of income than perhaps the universal credit they have. Although there is a grace period of 9 months exemption where things like the benefit cap do not apply if you've paid enough national insurance in recent times and similar. So it's taking on that level of work, and we are actively finding and establishing new job centres around the country to make sure that people can have that direct support. But you point to the digitalisation. I mean, the old systems simply would have fallen over, frankly, and we still have some of those old systems, but not for universal credit. And some of the things that we would normally experiment with, like digital interactions, as in video interactions, is something that we are trying to accelerate. I must admit, past research shows that face-to-face experiences are one of the most active ways to encourage people to keep looking for work. And of course, our Treasury friends will continue to remind us of that. But we have to deal with it in what is the COVID normal, at least for the foreseeable future. So there are elements like that, but also, for example, we are recruiting or retraining some people to be more proactively thinking about self-employed side of work coaches in that regard. Because we recognise that just as happened with previous recessions, quite often people will want to start their own enterprise, and that will take a more specialist level of support from DWP, as well as, of course, the access to things like startup loans.
Mm-hmm. And turning now to something that certainly I have a great interest in, and that is training. The Kickstart scheme, which is an apprenticeship subsidy, it looks an awful lot like, and this is something that is being mentioned by one of the questions that is being asked by our audience, the youth training scheme, one of the flagship schemes of the 1980s. Now, I was wondering if I could turn to Pam first for this question. I know that when it comes to training, Pam, you sort of slightly changed your mind over the course of the time as to the appropriate role that the training schemes should play in the overall mix of active labour market measures in a high unemployment situation. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Yes, in the 1980s, the evidence was very firmly that it was better to get people into jobs than to give them training, and that they would learn basic work skills on the job, and that that might ultimately lead to progression. There has been quite a lot of subsequent evidence, American evidence mainly, I should say, but following people up longer term. And what has become apparent is that people who undertake training when they're out of work, although it takes them longer to get into their first job after they become unemployed, they stick at it for longer and they have better attachment to the labour market long term, and they have higher earnings long term. So it really depends on whether what you're trying to do is to move people into jobs as quickly as possible for in short term, in terms of short term interest, or actually are you going to think about this as an opportunity to improve the skills base and improve productivity?
Okay.
And I think the Prime Minister's announcement last week, gives us some helpful indicators along this way. But actually, it is worth thinking, we do have a productivity problem, we do have a skills problem. Is the fact that we've got all this disruption, might it be better to make better use of the time that people are going to be idle by actually improving the national skill base?
Okay.
And I leave that as an open question because I know that training is more expensive, but as Warwick has said, borrowing is cheap at the moment. Now might be precisely the time to put some investment into improving the skill level of the population.
Okay. Warwick or Thérèse, would you like to come back on any of these points?
Well, one of the features of the furlough scheme was that if employers wanted to, they could, people didn't just have to stop work entirely, as in they could actually take up training with the employer. So I don't think we have a sense of quite how many employers chose to do that. But as Pam's just pointed out, the announcement by the Prime Minister and Gavin Williamson about trying to get some element of lifetime learning, particularly for those people who didn't go beyond effectively O-levels, CSEs and that level of BTEC, I think is an important intervention. But I don't think we should see things like Kickstart as solely being a substitute apprentice. It may be the gateway to an apprenticeship, but it is there to try and help people with that first rung on the jobs ladder, rather than, frankly, perhaps having no work experience and making it harder to do. So there are additional incentives for people to take on apprenticeships, but I'm conscious that for employers that's a longer term relationship, much more sophisticated and kind of focused training, but there's still a training element of about £1,500 which we will be sharing with any employer that takes on Kickstart. In terms of productivity changes, the government isn't going to dictate to businesses quite how they use this opportunity. We haven't seen yet radically, perhaps apart from the aviation sector, undertake that element. So British Airways could be a good example, although I have to say it's been rather irritating that they take advantage of the furlough scheme to help finance a lot of that approach. But nevertheless, it's we're still, I think, learning more about the economy and how it unfolds and what employers are still planning to do.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things, yeah, and I think that is worth bearing in mind about the training issue is that certainly in the American experience after the Great Recession, people would lose their job and they would discover a lot of their human capital was rather narrowly tied up in the previous 7 or 8 years working where they were, and they found it much harder to get other jobs at the same levels of pay where they would have the same degree of use. And therefore, I think there may well be good reasons to actually think with a bit more imagination about how we can help people at that point of disruption in their lives so that they actually re-equip themselves to go into a slightly higher level than they otherwise would do, where they'll be stepping back quite a long way.
Well, perhaps building on this point, Warwick, I know that one of the things that you are in particular interested is the role of careers advice and careers education in the overall active labour market policy mix. Now we know that extra funding for the National Careers Services is part of the Plan for Jobs announced in July. But do you think further reforms are needed, mainly on the perhaps on the localism element of the policy?
Yes, I certainly think that the government's right to think about how it can improve sort of labour market intelligence to help people navigate the labour market. Now, when I worked at the Department of Employment in the late 1980s, most of the things that the government did were actually quite sensible. But one of them was a very big mistake, and that was actually just scrapping at a stroke the school's career service. It wasn't perfect by any means, and it varied from local authority to local authority, but there was a very strong connection between town halls, schools, and practical jobs that youngsters leaving at 16 or 17 could get. And I think it would be nice if we can find a way of having greater involvement in local authorities within their labour markets. I don't think we should be trying to recreate the old school career service. And I think we've also got to take account of the fact that many young people coming into the labour market will be actually coming in maybe in their mid-20s after university education or even postgraduate education, and then discovering that the track they went down didn't lead them to an easy labour market outcome, and they'll need quite a lot of help of finding their way through that. But I think it would be very nice if we can find greater practical involvement of local authorities through regeneration, through their local schools and their local colleges in the labour market.
Thérèse, do you agree?
Well, I think, Warwick, building on what you've said, the National Careers Service is embedded into not all, but many of our job centres. So there is that way for people who are genuinely either trying to find a new way forward or still perplexed about where they really want to spend their lives in terms of gainful employment. But one of the approaches we've certainly taken with the Plan for Jobs, with all the different levels, as well as not just Kickstart, is to try and make sure we have a national framework but local delivery. And our job centres and area managers are, we've undertaken proactive work with mayoral combined authorities, probably Merseyside and West Midlands, Greater Manchester stand out in my mind, in order to try and make sure that we are not just setting people up to not have a local opportunity. So it's been about how making sure that I think we do have a good general knowledge of the local employment market on what we can do. And clearly, mayors in particular tend to have a sense of where they wish to really, they know where they've lost their jobs and what they might need to do to recover. I think it's greater, the Merseyside area, the Liverpool City region, where a substantial amount of their employment that they've lost has been in that sort of entertainment area. That's clearly quite a jolt at the moment with the nightclubs and other elements not reopening. So that's why we've also got our senior managers who have already been in touch and have worked with some of these local places in order to understand how we can best help respond.
Pam, would you like to come back on any of these points?
I agree. I agree with Warwick that the loss of the local career service was real loss. But actually, we can't go back and reinvent the wheel, and it wasn't perfect. I think, the trouble confronting young people entering the labour market is that their knowledge base is very limited. They know the jobs that their parents and their uncles and cousins and family and friends do, but that's always a microcosm of what's available locally. And indeed, within a wider region, most people are within an hour's travel of quite a wide range of different types of jobs. But actually, you don't know what you don't know is the fundamental problem confronting young people. And they probably don't think of the job centre as the first place to go and try and find this information. That's fundamentally the sort of knowledge gap.
Now, one question which is a rather open one, but I think is good that has come through from our audience is this a good opportunity to encourage people to move to sectors with long-term employee shortages, such as teaching, nursing, or indeed care work? Now, I know that this is something my colleague David Goodhart has just written a book about, and is very much interested in this issue. And indeed, one thing that has come up a lot in the past few months is, of course, who really are the key workers, if you like, in the UK. Are they really the kind of the high-paid professions, or actually are some of the most important key workers perhaps not as valued as they should be, both in terms of reward, but perhaps more importantly in terms of prestige? Thérèse, what do you think?
Well, I think the opportunity to move to sectors is definitely there, and I think that quite a lot of our focus and working across government, DWP single-handedly can't be trying to stimulate the creation of jobs across the economy. So the chance obviously has undertaken work, but I'm talking about people like Oliver Dowden and DCMS, obviously Alex Sharma at Bays and transport and similar. So I think that there are growth sectors that we are trying to focus and help people go towards. Those would be things like construction, other aspects of infrastructure, health and social care. I think teaching is a really interesting one, because certainly if there are people in certain kinds of quite specialist engineering or manufacturing elements, I can imagine something, I think the programme's called Teach Last as opposed to Teach First, which is proactively looking for people towards the end of their industrial careers to come in and share those skills, those really practical knowledge elements. And I think upgrading, or as the PM said the other day, trying to make FE and HE comparable is a really important part of making sure that we are well equipped as a country, as a society, as an economy to be more resilient. So in terms of the question about key workers, I think there's a variety of roles which get undertaken, anything from waste management to care workers, as was said, and a variety of ways to make sure that things like transport can keep running. Lorry drivers, again, are very much an industry with a lot of shortages, making sure that we can get the foods, the goods, the milk, wherever it is around the country, have all shown their worth in this time of when our normal economic exchanges have really had taken quite a blow.
Warwick, what do you think about this question?
It's a very difficult question because superficially we say, well, we really want to actually help all the key workers, but you'll discover that key workers come in all shapes, sizes and forms. I mean, forensic accountants are also key workers in ensuring that the system works properly, but they don't have quite the same glamour as a nurse, doctor, teacher or fireman. And I think the important thing is we've got to think very hard about how we can enable the economy to respond to what consumers want, and at the same time think very carefully. I mean, social care, I don't think is a labour market issue so much as an underfunding issue and a neglect issue within public policy going back to the 1948 National Insurance Act and National Health Service Act. So I'm more cautious about having a shopping list of jobs that we call key, that we give special support to. We've got to have a set of incentives that adequately respond to all the work that's needed, and I don't think we should be particularly isolating certain jobs.
Pam, would you like to come back on any of these points?
I think what the pandemic has shown us is that we're all dependent on each other.
Yes.
That there's a wide range of jobs which we suddenly realise that actually the world starts to fall to pieces. If your supermarkets don't get their deliveries, for example. But on the care sector, there is a labour market problem, and the labour market problem is that the wages are too low for the level of responsibility and actually the challenge of the work. And fundamentally, if you have an industry with 100,000 vacancies, which is what the care sector has at the moment, that is telling me as a labour market economist that they're not paying enough.
It's an efficiency wages issue, isn't it, Pam?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely.
And that was all due to the fact that it's been fundamentally underfunded, and the cap on the funding has got tighter ever since the implementation of the Griffiths report some 25 years ago.
It's got worse.
Yeah.
It's got worse. And, ultimately the system is, if the system is not going to collapse completely, something has to be done about, the funding and the wages.
Well, it's difficult to talk about the recent picture of the labour market without talking about the furlough scheme, which is currently scheduled to come to an end at the end of October, but to be replaced by the job support scheme, which is akin to the German Kurzarbeit scheme. Now, to me, this is the really interesting question around this is essentially, do we essentially hope that we will be saved by the bell of the vaccine in the next few months or so, in which case extending it might be a better idea. But if this is it for the foreseeable future, which is of course an unknown, we have to somehow learn to live with this, and we need to allow the economy to adapt, and those jobs which may be there in name only supported by furlough, these people need to have a chance to essentially to adapt. Now, I was wondering if I could turn to Warwick for this question of from the point of view of allowing businesses to adapt. I'm talking about things like, for example, converting office space to flats as people no longer need so much office space. Perhaps emphasizing digital infrastructure as things like this, Zoom conferences, become even more important. What do you think are the key measures that the government can take to really essentially say to people, say to businesses, you find a way, and we will support you in this, or we will get out of the way in the way of that adaptation?
Well, I think that one of the tests of an economy is, can it adjust to change, particularly when that change is unwelcome and quite sudden. And I think that the pandemic has expedited quite a lot of change that would have taken place. Pam's referred to the challenges in the retail sector. I also think the capacity to use technology for home working, and maybe if you're running a business, you haven't got to have 100 people in an office in the middle of Birmingham or Manchester, and you can have them working from home, and you save on the business rates and on the lease on the premises. I mean, there'll be changes like that have been expedited, and I think one's got to accept those changes will happen, and I wouldn't try to artificially override it. I think that this is where having an eye to ensuring there's enough demand in the economy to facilitate change, rather than saving individual workplaces as they're currently constructed. The more difficult thing is, if there's a sector that isn't going to be needed for 3 months, 6 months, 18 months, 2 years or 3 years, I'm thinking of cruise ships, some aspects of foreign travel, to what extent do you try and save it as it is, or do you accept that, I'm thinking of the cinema company that has just said they're effectively going to give up on their premises because of the lack of blockbusters being issued. To what extent do you say, well, we've just got to accept certain parts of the economy are not going to be in play in the coming 18 months as they would have been before? It's a very difficult thing to get right. And I think I would have an eye to the overall support for the economy through generalised demand, tax cuts, cuts to national insurance, and also programmes to help people who are caught out, rather than saving firm by firm. And I think the Chancellor was right to begin to move away from the furlough scheme myself.
Pam and Thérèse, would you like to come back on any of these points?
Well, I actually think Warwick's articulated it well, the choices that lie ahead of us. And I think undoubtedly the support's been there. The intention of the slight changes in the scheme towards the end of October was done deliberately, so there wasn't just a cliff edge. Clearly now there's a further evolution of this, which, as you pointed out, is akin to others. And this really is an opportunity for some of those sectors, I think, will be considering, for example, your restaurants or similar. They'll be starting to consider, well, I can never get a great chef, so I'm going to try and keep that chef and use the scheme that way. Whereas there may be other elements. So it won't just be about high-paid people. It will be about where have I struggled to really recruit people in the past. And again, that's going to be a choice for employers rather than the government. But I think that this successor scheme gives them those businesses as we go into winter, as we go into the ongoing challenge of the local measures with differential outcomes in different parts of the country, having an impact on those sectors really coming to fruition. But I still feel that instead of the blanket furlough scheme, it is right to bring that to an end and have this more tailored approach.
Pam, what are your views on this issue?
I think the furlough scheme was a necessary safety net at the time. I think, as an economist, I would say in retrospect, it was probably a bit too generous. Because people have not had to travel to work, they've not had to pay for lunches and coffee and work clothes and all of that sort of stuff, that under the furlough scheme, some of them have been better off, and that's probably not what the intention was. But ultimately, if the economy has got to go through some sort of structural adjustment, postponing it by subsidising stuff which is not going to be there in the long term is not a sensible way to use your resources. You're much better off using your resources, trying to encourage people to set up new businesses or to help growing businesses and concentrate that way, because that's how you improve things in the longer term. The there was all this talk, after the financial crisis about zombie companies. And actually, what we don't want is zombie jobs. We want real jobs where there's real demand.
Now, one of the questions which has come through from our audience, which is extremely open one, but I think it's one that has been that a lot of people have been asking themselves for well, ever since the start of the pandemic. Where does this leave the government's leveling up agenda, or perhaps the building back better, as it is now known? Thérèse, would you like to?
I think this actually gives us even more acceleration into achieving those outcomes. Prime Minister set out very early on. We're not seeking to have austerity or anything like that. He really does want to invest. The government wants to invest in the people of Britain, in the entrepreneurs of Britain, and as a consequence, I do actually think this odd thing where we've seen actually a significant drop in the spending in places like London and Edinburgh. Meanwhile, more local economies have actually seen an increase in spending, and it's a mixed picture around the country, but undoubtedly there is elements there, and of course Eat Out to Help Out was done to try and help stimulate the hospitality. So one of the things I think that will be learned from this time is how we can continue to be or enhance our resilience against similar shocks in the future. So whether that's about as households, but also as governments, there are opportunities for us to consider potentially about how we must make sure we always have perhaps more of our own manufacturing processes on items where we've recognised there's been a global shortage, as well as the growth elements of the ongoing investment in R&D, which will be happening as well. So those are kind of higher, kind of hopefully ultimately productive and financially rewarding outcomes. So there's a mixture of opportunities here, but I think that the intention, actually, we've slightly got a leveler playing field on which to grow, as it were, in different parts of the country, not just try and focus on London and South East.
Well, Warwick, perhaps if I can turn to you on a slight variation of this question. I know that you have you have some you frequently speculate where this might leave the city centre.
Well, I think, yeah, and it's absolutely fascinating because the government's levelling up agenda was an ambitious agenda set out in the general election last year. And the big difficulty is you were trying to often go against the grain of where the public were wanting to go. So they were often looking at jobs and parts of the country, and we were suggesting they might like to invest and go elsewhere. The pandemic, I think, has brought home to people the advantages of open space, having access to parks, having access to gardens and all sorts of things, having a house that's a bit cheaper, so you've got more room in it. And so I think the levelling up agenda may well be going with some of the grain of what people might actually want, rather than going against it. So I think there's more opportunity genuinely with that levelling up agenda than there was before. The other more narrow and more technical thing is that the levelling up agenda was inevitably going to turn on providing infrastructure investment and things in places like my hometown of Plymouth, where I'm speaking from now, which on a narrow economic analysis may not yield very much of a rate of return. Now, Policy Exchange has done some work on this, and we said, well, even if it doesn't meet the narrow economic criteria, there may well be other amenity and wider social and political criteria that means that give them that roundabout, give them that bypass, give them that bridge, or whatever it happens to be. And, of course, having very anchored levels of inflation and very low rates of interest that in the last 6 months have got a lump lower, both of them, means that it's going to be easier for the government to pursue that agenda than otherwise. So I think they're going with the grain of what the public might want, and they'll have more opportunities technically in the gilt market to do so as well.
Pam, you mentioned in your initial speech, the differences in the patterns of unemployment, about how this time it might not be concentrated in particular geographic areas, etc. Do you have a view on how this this affects the government's regional development agenda?
I think this is one for me.
Okay. Well, we are coming to the end, and I was wondering if in the final minutes of the event I could ask each of the panelists to just perhaps give us one takeaway from this discussion that that they would like to emphasize, starting with Thérèse.
Well, I think it just shows that the government is absolutely committed to protecting people in this country with the unprecedented scheme that we undertook of the furlough scheme and the self-employed scheme, as well as being ready, and we are ready in the future, to help people who need to turn to the welfare safety net. I certainly hope we don't get quite the surge that we had back in March and April, when people understandably turned to us straight away, and that we actually, with all the measures we've undertaken, we can have that more confidence in the future, encouraging employers to, and indeed people to spend money to go and have that confidence to do so, recognising that the constraints that we had early in the year with the real lockdowns, they're not there anymore. There are some localised measures which are more constricting, but all the shops are open, certainly all the schools are open, and so I think that we are in this situation where a lot of this will be about helping people back into work and giving confidence in making sure that we can continue to start to expand the economy again after what's been one of the biggest ever contractions in the shortest amount of time.
Pam, your one key message.
I would say, this has all come upon us not through anything that anybody chose to do, and we can either look back with nostalgia, or we can look forward and say, what sort of a society do we want to emerge from this? And I think we do need to focus on looking forward and on trying to think about what we could get out of this positively and try and see it as an opportunity.
Okay, and finally, Warwick, your one key takeaway for...
It'd be two, really. One is, don't find ways of undermining the genuinely flexible and adaptable labour market we've got by introducing regulations and rules that sound very attractive on a panel like this, but can do a lot of damage in the long term. So try not to do any damage. And the other one is, if it turns out that we've got a big continuing problem, there's a lack of demand, I think it's very important the government should respond audaciously and use the opportunity it's got with these very low rates of interest, this very low rate of inflation. Don't hold back.
Okay. Well, I think this is all we have time for. Thank you very much to Thérèse Coffey for joining us. Thank you to Pam Meadows, and thank you to Warwick Lightfoot. And please join us tomorrow for another day of Policy Exchange Conservative Party conference events. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan.
Thank you. Bye.